So I am Professor Daniel Breyer. That's how you say my last name. It's not Breyer. If you do it, I won't talk to you anymore. I am from Illinois State University. I'm a full professor there in philosophy. I went here to the Graduate Institute and graduated in 2001. That was so long ago. Before that, I got a degree in classics. I don't know those languages. From the University of Montana. And then after that, well, that was confusing. After St. John's, I went to New York City and I got a PhD in philosophy at Fordham University. At Fordham, I was a little confused about what I was doing. You know, I was a classics major, and then I came here, and then I just wanted to continue to study things, but I knew that I wanted to do philosophy. But I didn't really know about graduate programs and like rankings and prestige and all that kind of thing. So I didn't go to Columbia, and I went to Fordham, and I kind of went there because they were so pluralistic. That was interesting to me. I did not know what that meant and still don't. But when I got there, I discovered analytic philosophy, which was kind of rare at Fordham because it's mostly a place that focuses on the so-called continental tradition. But I found somebody who liked me, yay, and who really helped me. His name was John Greco. He became my mentor. He's kind of a big deal in analytic epistemology, the theory of knowledge. While I was there, though, I also started to get interested in, I don't know what to call it, world philosophy, non-Western philosophy. Here you still call it Eastern philosophy. And I had been kind of interested in it while I was here, and one of my plans was to enter into the Eastern Classics program here. But things happened, and I went somewhere else. So after I got done with my coursework, I started to think about what I was going to do my dissertation on. And originally, that was going to be free will and moral responsibility, but my dissertation director said, I'm kind of a big deal in epistemology, maybe you should do it in that. And I was like, okay. So in a lot of my published work and my dissertation, I kind of blend theories of autonomy with epistemology to solve a bunch of problems you don't care about. But while I was working on all that, I was also teaching. I had a nice senior teaching fellowship at Fordham, but New York City is really expensive, so I illegitimately also taught elsewhere. Don't tell them. This is live streamed. So during that, I kind of, to your surprise, I became a kind of popular teacher at Rutgers University Newark, not the one you were thinking. And there, they kind of started to just let me teach courses. They're like, what do you want to teach? And I was like, okay. And they had a course on the books called Eastern Philosophy, but nobody ever taught it, so I thought, I'll teach that. And I knew pretty much nothing about that. So I started to teach myself. And then at Fordham, there was this guy, Chris Gowans. Chris Gowans is a kind of an important, broadly analytic thinker who looks at Buddhism. He has got a bunch of great books. He's smart, he's clear. He also kind of sounds like the agent in the Matrix, which is always cool. But I didn't have a chance to take any classes with him because nobody wanted to take those classes, so they just always got canceled. It's like my life now. Then in 2007, when I was just about done, I had a baby on the way, I needed to find a job, everything was fine. I saw a flyer for a talk at the Columbia Society for Comparative Philosophy from this talk by Mark Sideritz on paleocompatibilism, which is this idea that the Buddhist tradition the Indian Buddhist tradition, broadly conceived, has the resources to offer a new perspective on the so-called problem of freedom and determinism, or stuff you might worry about that has to do with free will and moral responsibility. And I was really excited for that. So I took the time, I went, I even had a friend visiting me. Nobody ever visited me, but somebody was that time, and I took him to the talk. And so Mark Sideritz is up there. He's given this talk, and I find it really interesting because, I don't know if you remember, I was really interested in free will stuff, but then I had to do epistemology because I was in trouble. And I knew a lot of the contemporary literature. So the talk was over, and there was a Q&A session. The Q&A session was dominated by people who asked questions that were too long and didn't make sense. Has that ever happened? Is that foreshadowing? And so I didn't have time to ask this question. I was just a graduate student, so I went up, I got my courage, and I went up and I said, Dr. Sideritz, I have 2 questions for you. Do you have any time? And he said, I have exactly 2 minutes. And I thought, this is starting well. And so I said, okay, here's my first question. Do you think your view is like this view? And he said, no. And that was it. And then I was like, okay. And then we had to walk. That's not as far back as I thought. We had to walk. And so I'm walking, and I'm talking, and I'm like, hey, did you ever think that maybe you could have a view that's like this? And I used some thinkers' names and stuff. And he said, and I quote, well, backing into an elevator, that will not compute. Right? Which was amazing, and you should have laughed, and you missed your chance to laugh at that. And that's on you, because that's hilarious. So that was a good conversation. It was terrible. So I said to a closing elevator, well, I guess we'll just battle that out in print. I said that. What? That's a badly written movie, which is my life. So I thought, well, now I'm really interested in this. Now, I know I'm giving you too much background, but they'll remember to introduce me in the future. So I'm on the job market. There's this baby coming. Job market and philosophy is, everybody gets a job and it's fine. Not really. The job market is bad. I came out in 2008, one of the good years, they say, and it wasn't. I got a lot of interviews. The job I ultimately got, that was foreboding. For you listening, that was thunder. And one of the places I got a job offer from, and one of the places that I initially got interviewed at, was Illinois State. Hey, that's where I am. Guess where Mark Sideritz was at? Illinois State. So he calls me up and asks me to interview. And I think he knows who I am, because that's how much of a narcissist I am. And he has no idea. But he asks me out. He's real nice. Come out. I talk with him. And during dinner, I make the mistake of saying who I was. And he says, oh, you were that guy? And I thought, this is going well. Okay, now ultimately I get the job. And now I'm sort of where Mark Sideritz was. I kind of have the job, I think. They can't really tell you the reasons. Because I could carry on Mark Sideritz's legacy. It's weird that I just now mispronounced his name. I think that was a Freudian slip. So I'm telling you all this because the way I approach cross-cultural philosophy, which is the topic of this talk, I got to it real fast, is very much like Sideritz. That's right. Again, a badly written movie. So Sideritz approaches cross-cultural philosophy in a way that has been really influential and is accompanied by elevator music currently. Oh, that's a good approach. Oh, yeah. Wow. It would be good if I powered through those things, but then I would be a different person. So Mark Sideritz approaches cross-cultural philosophy by taking, the tools of analytic philosophy, whatever that is, and looking at non-analytic traditions that don't count as something, let's call them non-Western. In particular, he focuses on Buddhist philosophy, and in particular on Indian Buddhist philosophy. So that's kind of what I do, sort of. I said that I was an epistemologist. I do that, free will stuff, but I've done a little in this area. I've published a couple of things. Now, what I want to do today, that was the introduction to me. That was just all about me. What I want to do today is talk to you about what cross-cultural philosophy is and give you everything that's very sympathetic but then wants to try to do work. So these aren't mutually exclusive, but you can kind of, put them in little buckets. Now, when I was talking about cross-cultural philosophy, the way I started to talk about it was as like comparative philosophy. And that comparative philosophy very often felt a little bit more like intellectual history. Here are these arguments. Here are these arguments. Hey, look how similar they are. But as you move more into doing something like the history of philosophy, things can start to change. So obviously, if you're an expert in Confucian philosophy, you will be very much like an expert in Aristotle. You'll focus on the texts, and you might approach them as an intellectual historian or as a philosopher of history. That's the wrong thing. I knew I was going to say that. You won't do that. That's not what I meant. You might approach them as a philosopher doing the history of philosophy. But if you're just doing that, you also might not want to do the cross-cultural comparisons. So you can have on each side people just focusing on a single sort of tradition or a single thinker. Comparative philosophy starts when you're focusing on, say, Shankara, and you start to see that Shankara has these ideas that are similar to other ideas, but maybe you become more critical and you think, well, actually, Shankara has some things to say that might help us address some philosophical worries we already have. Or you might look in Shankara and you might say, oh, there's this problem I didn't even realize we should be worried about. Or you might say, oh, Shankara was worried about the same problem. Now, the more comparative you are, I'm going to suggest here, the more you're interested in marking those similarities and differences. But as you start to do the thing that Sideritz does, and that I find interesting, it's less about comparison, and it's more about something else. It's a lot like what it is for somebody who studies Aristotle and thinks that Aristotle can solve our contemporary problems. What Sideritz has called this approach before in the past, he called it fusion philosophy. And I like that. Fusion philosophy is modeled on the idea of fusion music or fusion cuisine. So if you have two separate culinary traditions and you wed them, it's a recipe for deliciousness, right? Maybe. Or it's an experiment of sorts. So you take the resources of one tradition and the resources of another, and you bring them together, you fuse them together, and you get something new. For reasons I don't fully understand, Sideritz stopped using fusion philosophy and started talking about confluence. So this moves the metaphor from food to rivers, which is a lot more boring. So now you have two streams. Oh, this is a separate stream. And then they come together to make another stream, right? Is it a bigger stream? I'm not entirely sure. The fusion idea resonates more with me. It looks like there's really genuinely something we didn't have before. You know, a Thai burrito. I mean, you can pull that off. Yum. Okay. So that's the idea of cross-cultural philosophy as fusion philosophy. There's something that's supposed to be creative about it. But it's also supposed to be grounded in the kind of argumentative tradition that you might have when you have philosophers looking at the history of philosophy and engaging with the texts on their own terms, sure, but also as genuine philosophical works that can be criticized and should withstand criticism. Okay, so I like that. And I'm not really suggesting that we depart so much from that approach, but I am going to suggest that maybe there's a slightly different way to think about this. That instead of something like fusion and confluence, we get to a place where it's more like about collaboration. And the collaboration idea is grounded in my suggestion that maybe we should think of cross-cultural philosophy as a kind of genuine conversation. The lights flickered. So to set that up, I need to do a couple of things. One thing I want to do is just briefly outline some problems that cross-cultural philosophy, very broadly construed, might run into. And then I want to take small steps towards suggesting how it is that we could see cross-cultural philosophy as a conversation. This is going to be really schematic and hand-wavy, but I think it might be helpful. And so to show that it's helpful, I'll revisit the problems I outlined and suggest a way that the conversational model can help us feel better about the problems, approach them in a way that maybe they wouldn't be so worrisome. And then, if I have time, I'm going to raise an objection to the conversational model and try to respond to it. Okay? I realize that's a lot of signposting, but I was trained as an analytic philosopher, and so I have to do it. Also, I'm very tired, and I needed a rest. That was just a lie. Okay, so one problem you maybe even just have in your head right now is the worry of cultural appropriation. So, when very roughly, you have a dominant culture that takes a less dominant culture's ideas or products and then presents them as their own, that is a real problem. And it's especially problematic when it's exploitive and disrespectful. Also just kind of feels like it's a problem if you do it. So you might think of it as the first problem is a kind of plagiarism. And then the other problems are just really mean plagiarism, where you're also exploiting and disrespecting the people. Now there's all kinds of examples of cultural appropriation. I'll let you think of your own. But that's a worry here. Right? And it's a worry that I have. I'll just tell you a little story that's now going to live stream to the world. So I teach Indian philosophy and Buddhist philosophy at my university. And so I am the representative of Buddhist philosophy and Indian philosophy. And you can see where I'm going, right? So I had a student, a great student, one of the best students I've ever had, and she was doing some work with international students, and she was talking to a bunch of students from India, and she said, "Oh, I'm in Indian philosophy." And then they were excited that there was this class. So that part of the story, I was like, yeah, I'm doing good things. And then they said, "Oh, is he from India?" And she said, "Oh, no, he's just a white guy from Montana." So that's the name of my memoir. And it has "just" in the front of it, just a white guy from Montana. But right, and then I was like, oh, and then she was like, no, it was fine. Everybody thought, and I thought, is it fine? right? So there's lots of potential problems here. Now, I try not to be the kind of person who's suggesting that this is my tradition, right? And I have lots of Indian students in my classes. I have lots of students whose parents came from India. I have lots of students who know the tradition from the inside in ways I don't. And I always try to say, I do not know what I'm talking about, except insofar as we're talking about these philosophical texts. But I'm always worried about this, okay? So when it comes to doing cross-cultural philosophy, I mean, is it a problem that somebody like Jay Garfield, who, you know, he's also a white guy, I don't know where he's from, not Montana. Is it a problem that he's kind of a face of Buddhist philosophy? And, you know, you might say, well, no. Or you might worry that it is. The cultural appropriation worry is especially worrisome when it comes to presenting these ideas as though, like, you're the one. So that's a worry. Now, you can see all kinds of ways to try to avoid this, I imagine, but I'm hoping that the conversational model will, like, give us some further resources. Another problem that you might have, which is, you know, related to this, is what you can think of as projection. So if I go to a text, just any text, just, you know, in any tradition, and you project your own views onto it, you're doing real damage. But it becomes more likely and even more damaging when you approach a text that's completely outside of what you're familiar with, because then you're really not understanding it on your own terms. So, you know, early on in the development of comparative philosophy, a lot of people recognized that, you know, Confucian ethics, broadly conceived, maybe take Mengzi in particular, looks a lot like Aristotelian ethics. Right? They both look like they're articulating a kind of virtue ethics. Now, that might be a good thing to notice, but you're probably going to do a lot of damage to the Confucian tradition by incorporating Aristotelian assumptions, whether those be Aristotle's teleological assumptions or, say, your own naturalistic assumptions. So you don't want to project your own views onto this stuff. And this is also a worry that I have, since I'll continue to throw myself under the bus. I regret every time I open my mouth, ever. There you go. It's over. So I, in my work, have looked at Buddhist axiology, what is the right view of early Indian Buddhist value theory. And, you know, I've tried not to project things, but I worry about that. One worry there is, does the early Buddhist tradition even consider this problem? Or am I projecting their consideration of the problem itself? I've also looked at Buddhist approaches to free will and moral responsibility, and one real worry there is, do they even have a sense of the same kinds of problems? Okay, so projection is another worry. Another concern that we can have is chauvinism, right? So here, the way I'm thinking of this is that you would just see yourself as superior. I am obviously from a superior intellectual tradition, and so everything everybody else says doesn't quite meet the standards. That's just obviously awful, but I don't know if you know this, pretty common. It's pretty common. Okay, so I want to avoid that. I'm not going to give my own example of that one because I don't have it. You like that? Okay. Then another concern is incommensurability. You know, that's a good St. John's word, right? Oh, is he talking about the Mino? No. Incommensurability is here the idea that there's just no common ground. You know, like you approach this tradition and you want to find a way in, but there's just no way for you to align your interests with that tradition. What's going on? Has it ever rained this hard here? I'm just kidding. Of course it has. I lived here. But you were supposed to say, no, so everybody could hear. That's right. It's just me. I am the rain bringer. Now, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to regret it immediately. But I sweat so much at the gym that I have given my name to myself as the rain bringer. So that's real gross. And you didn't need to know that. But now you do. And you can't unknow it. Try to not think about it. White bear, don't think about it. Okay. So incommensurability, that would be a real problem because then there's no way to really even get started. But if you've started, that means you're projecting. And now it's just a big mess. Then there's this other problem. Maybe there's a common ground, but pretty soon things diverge so much that it's unclear whether these traditions can really relate to each other. Whether it's useful at all to try to put one into the other's box. Here, I think an example of this would be there's a lot of naturalized or secular approaches to Buddhism now. And that diverges pretty sharply from how the Indian Buddhist tradition in particular saw itself. So questions about soteriology, like, what do I have to do to get saved, dominate early Indian Buddhist philosophy. But if you remove those, what do? Are your paths diverging too much? Or is it okay? Stephen Batchelor works a lot on this, but also people like Mark Sideritz, and also me, right? So I'm glad I'm saying this on the internet. I am a naturalistic atheist, right? Oh no. So when I try to get some insights out of a text from the Buddhist philosopher Shantideva, well, there are certain things that we share in common, right? Shantideva also doesn't think that there's an all-powerful creator God. But Shantideva has a lot of supernaturalistic-ish beliefs that I don't have. And Shantideva thinks the Buddha is really important to salvation. And, oh no, I'm saying this too. I don't. So, that one. So, what do we do with this? Do our paths diverge too much or not? Then, last problem I'll mention is there's a problem here with, I don't know how to frame this. I want to frame it as like a translation problem or a communication problem or a mediation problem. So these traditions are not just distant in time maybe or in culture, but they also are available to us in languages that most of us don't know. And if you do know some of them, good for you, but you don't know all of them. So can you only engage with those traditions whose languages you know? And then how well? And then do you know that you know them like they knew them? Right? Now, this is obviously a problem with everything that, for me, isn't written in very simple English. But it seems like an especially big problem here because, a lot of the Buddhist tradition, especially the Indian Buddhist tradition, it just hasn't been translated. Like, it's just not even available in English. So what do you make of that? Can you make claims like, whoa, the Buddhist tradition thought this, and then you're like, I don't know, I haven't read that, right? I do. So that seems like kind of a problem. Okay, so those are some of the problems, and I'm going to suggest that the conversational model can help us see how we might approach those and not be so worried about them. It's not going to dissolve the problems. They're real problems. But to do that, I have to be able to suggest how cross-cultural philosophy could be conversational. And there's lots of ways to do this, and I'm not entirely sure what the right way to do it is. One natural way is to look at like the philosophy of language and try to articulate what the nature of a conversation is in that way. And I feel like that's not going to be helpful. But as a way to show that I don't think it's going to be helpful, I thought I'd just briefly talk about Grice and what Grice says about conversational maxims. And I'm also not an expert at this sort of thing, so there will be no follow-up questions. Okay. So Paul Grice is famous for talking about pragmatics as opposed to semantics in linguistics and philosophy of language. Conversational implicature is something that he is, probably the first person to notice. And conversational implicature comes about when somebody says something, but what they say doesn't have all the meaning come with it that gets communicated. And the way that Grice kind of articulates this is by noting the general structure of what a conversation looks like. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about that. The general structure of a conversation, and here he's trying to be descriptive. Right? This is, ordinary language philosophy, where we're going to hopefully be able to say something important. And lots of people think that what Grice says is important, and there are still neo-Griceans. So the first thing that Grice notices is that, kind of in general, conversations are cooperative, right? Because you're not really having a conversation if it's not cooperative. And it might fail to be cooperative in lots of different ways, but I have a little example from my vacation that I went on. So I was talking to somebody, and I had this little story. I'll tell you the little story. So we were in the Northern Cascades National Park, which I did not know about, and is beautiful. I highly recommend it. And we went to the nature center, which I thought was closed, and then it was open, and it was just like Christmas. And I go in there, and I buy stickers, and I buy cups, because I collect cups. And I'm buying the boys' T-shirts, and we'd asked a park ranger whether the little river trail was worth doing, and he was like, totally was, and it was. So I thought, who better to ask for advice about what single hike could we do today that would really offer us the most bang for our buck? That's how I framed it. That's how I talk. So I asked him, and he says his response to this is, do you have snowshoes or ice pick? What are they called? Picks? Pikes? Little steely things for your... I don't even know how to talk about it because of course we don't. Right? Why would I ask you this question if I had snowshoes? Huh? I'm with 3 boys and I just bought a T-shirt. So I think this story is very funny. And then I was telling somebody, and then their response to it was to explain why he'd asked that. And then I was like, I don't know what's happening now. And then his wife was like, what's going? That's not what. And then he said, we're having a conversation here. Right? And I thought, no, we're not. No, we're not. Right? Things just kind of fell apart. Thankfully, they don't have the internet. Okay, so conversations are cooperative. And it's not a conversation if it's not cooperative. It can go wrong in many ways. It could be a monologue. I could pretend like this is a conversation, but I'm the only one talking. Okay, so they're cooperative. But then he tries to make this much more precise. And I'm not going to go through this very carefully, but there are 4 famous maxims. And there's a super maximum, sub maxims, and I'm not going to go into that. But just very roughly, the maxims are first, quality. In a conversational context, you should give the right amount of information, right? Don't give me too much. I violate that one all the time. And don't give me too little. Now, it'll turn out that if somebody gives you too little information, sometimes that can lead to conversational implicature. I'm not going to explain that because that's not the point here. The point is, this is one of these things that Grice thinks makes for the basic structure of a normal conversation. Then there's the maxim of quality, right? So here you want to be truthful. Say things that are true, and then say things that you have evidence for. You know, this conversations can really break down when you just say stuff, right? Okay. Then there's the maxim of relation, which is, it means be relevant, right? You know, when I say something, the thing that you should say should be relevant to what I've just said. You know, that doesn't happen as much as you might want. You ever been talking to somebody and you realize you're having it's like parallel play with children. Like they're doing their own separate thing, you know, and then the person will respond, but they're not really talking to each other, they're just talking. And then there's the maxim of manner. And that just means something very, you know, roughly, be clear. Right? Try to be lucid. Okay, so Grice does a lot of really interesting things with this. And for a little while, I felt like I had to talk about all of them. And then I looked at myself in the mirror and I was like, you need to stop it. So I'm pushing past saying anything more to point out the reason I wanted to talk about this is this kind of seems like a non-starter way to think about how cross-cultural philosophy would be a conversation. And I can't just say that. I think it's important to notice why. There's 2 reasons. One is that Grice is talking about the actual interaction in dynamic real time of people engaged in talking. And that's not the kind of conversation we want to talk about. We're going to talk about a kind of textual conversation, or a response in text, or a response to people who aren't around anymore to continue that conversation. So this probably isn't the greatest place to start, but it is a way to think, oh, well, maybe this is just a dead end. Maybe this is a bad way to approach this. The other problem with starting here, but I think it's instructive, is that this is a kind of descriptive account of how conversations are supposed to work, right? You probably want to modify it, and people have, and maybe it's not exactly right, but it doesn't aim to provide a normative framework for conversations. So what we need, or what I need, is to try to figure out how this kind of textual conversation, or conversation with people who aren't around anymore, might work. That sounds hard. And then also figure out a normative framework for what a good conversation would be. So part of what I want to suggest is that cross-cultural philosophy isn't just a conversation, but that it should be a great conversation. And that idea of a great conversation, that's very nice, but what does that mean exactly, aside from, you know, just having a kind of dialogue between different texts? So if let's start with the second problem, the problem of finding a normative framework. So we can go in a couple of different ways, and I'm going to do that, and just make some hand-wavy suggestions. One is that we could look at Jeffrey Leach's maxims of politeness, because that's normative. So if you have a good conversation with somebody, the conversation doesn't just follow these kind of descriptive rules. It should have kinds of norms that guide it. So here's just some of these. There's the maxim of tact. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, it's good to be tactful, right? Instead of saying, hey, go get my shoes, you say something like, oh, hey, well, you're up. Could you, if it doesn't bother you too much, would you please? Never mind, I'll do it. So you want to be tactful. You can explain that more, but you get it. Then there's also the maxim of approbation. I just say, you never get a chance to say approbation. But that's just like, you don't want to, be mean to people that much, and you want to be a lot nicer to them. So you shouldn't dispraise them, blame them, any more than you have to, and you should praise them. Say nice things. People like nice things, right? Your mom taught you that. Okay. This is a way to be polite. Because if you're always criticizing people, it's not fun to have conversations with. Then there's also the maxim of sympathy. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, you should be sympathetic. If they say something, you should be sensitive to what's going on with them. Maybe you've told somebody something difficult about your life, and then they just kind of skirted past it. Like my cat just died, and they're like, "Oh, the weather." Oh, my cat died though. Okay. Now there's others, but you start to get the idea. Maybe we can find some basic standards that would help us make sense of what a good conversation would be, so that we could start to apply this idea to thinking about cross-cultural philosophy. So with that in mind, I like to think about how couples therapists tell you to talk, okay? This doesn't say anything about me. The Gottmans, John and Julie Gottman, who have paid me to be here today. They haven't. They have the Gottman Institute. This sounds like a cult. It's not, though. Probably. I don't know. They're psychologists, but they work with couples. They've done all kinds of really interesting work, but they have advice for having intimate conversations. That just makes me feel uncomfortable to say that. And apparently, it makes the clouds uncomfortable, too. So when you have a close conversation with somebody, or a conversation about something difficult, things can go bad, right? I don't know if you know this. Do you not know it yet? Well, that's good. It's easy for people's feelings to get hurt. So what are some principles that you would have to try to avoid that? Well, they have one kind of overarching rule, which is understand first, offer advice second, which is a rule everyone, everywhere, at all times violates, right? So this is connected with, that was a lot of lightning, just right there, that I could see real close. That house is on fire. It's not, as far as I know. So this is also then associated with active listening, right? So I think this is a helpful way to think about conversations. So when you're actively listening, it's not what my son currently does. So thank goodness he'll never see this. So he's 16, and he does not pay attention to anything that I say ever at this point. It's weird, actually. On our long trip, at some point I had to be like, "What's happening? Do you not hear me?" He's like, "Not really." Okay, so active listening means, first off, pay attention, right? Pay attention to what somebody's saying, and you could pretend like you're paying attention. You might know that. Oh, but really pay attention, and don't think about what you're gonna say. right? That's a main kind of thing that people like to do. I really have something important to say and your mouth is still moving, but I need to keep it in my head. Well, what I was thinking, okay. Now at St. John's, none of you do that. That's not true. But you understand that you shouldn't be doing that and that you should actively listen and pay attention. And so that's important, but it's not just enough to pay attention, because you might be paying attention, but you might not be really understanding things. So you got to check yourself a little. You do that in part by asking questions. And you can ask different kinds of questions. Very broadly, you can ask open-ended questions. You know, in a conversation with somebody, you might go, "How does that make you feel?" You know, or, "Oh, geez, boy, what did you do then?" Or you could ask like more searching questions. You know, and phrasing those is a little harder. But you might say, "Oh, well, you know, I heard you say this, but I was wondering," and there you're also doing two other things. You're kind of paraphrasing somebody, and you're asking for clarification. You're trying to make sure you're clear about what they think, not about what you think that they think. And the whole time, you should be sensitive to how they're feeling. Right? So when you're talking with somebody, you should see and you know, you could be oversensitive. I'm a little oversensitive to what's going on with people, because I can tell like pretty reliably that people are upset. And then I go, "Oh, are you upset?" And then that just makes them more upset. And then they're like, "No, I'm not upset." And I'm like, "Well, I'm right." And then we're in a fight. So that's bad. So you want to be sensitive, but you also can't handle it in a way where you project things on people. Watch for cues, things like that. Okay. And then the ultimate goal here should be that when that conversation ends, you can summarize it. A therapist of mine, I didn't have a therapist. I'm just joking. A therapist of mine called this drive-through communication. And I like that, right? So when you go through the drive-through, which you probably have never been to a drive-through, but I'll explain the experience. You go and you have to order into a giant clown mouth. And you say, "I want a hamburger." And then they go, "Whoa." And then you go, "I want a hamburger." So the drive-through communication isn't going to work unless they're reading things back. They'll be like, "Okay, so this is what I heard you say. You want a hamburger with mustard and ketchup?" And at some point you go, "Oh, no, I didn't say ketchup." And then you're on the same page, right? That part is really important in conversations in general, because you can leave a conversation thinking you really understand what somebody else is thinking, when in fact you really haven't. Okay, so I like this idea from the Gottmans and other people about active listening. Here's one other thing I'll suggest in my 4 minutes that I have left, is that we might get something out of another approach, which I think is called communication accommodation theory. And the nugget here is, when you're talking with somebody and you're having a good conversation, you tend to accommodate their way of talking. Now that can be problematic. You don't want to mimic people. But like an example in my own life that's like kind of weird, if we're watching basketball all together and one of the kids says, "Boy, he got cooked." I can't say that, right? I'm too old and dumb to be like, "Hey, he really cooked him, didn't he?" But I will start. I've found myself using that while we talk, and then I have to be like, "I'm so sorry that, So I want to accommodate how they talk, but I can't pretend like that's how I talk. So this is delicate, right? On the trip, they asked me a series of questions about whether I knew certain phrases and words, and the answer was 100% no all the time, right? And I can't pretend like I know, but I can accommodate them and allow them to talk that way and engage with them. I like this. That seems promising. Okay, so there's lots of other ways, I think, that we could think about what makes a great conversation. I'll mention just this one, and then I'll try to say how, very briefly, I think this resolves the problems. One other thing is that I said this should be a collaborative approach. And I think here we can think of collaborative conversations as being driven by these norms, and we have a goal to build something together, to build on our ideas, to make an argument better, to work on a text, to do something. And to do that, we have to collaborate in the space of these norms. Otherwise, things start to fall apart. And when we do that, it makes me think of what the philosopher Robert Caine, in his work on free will, says when he talks about the importance of libertarian free will, the ability to do otherwise. And he recognizes that it's a risk when you act freely, when you do something that, from his perspective, is a torn decision. You could have gone this way, or you could have gone that way. He recognizes it as a risk, but he thinks that's the risk that's worth taking. It's a value experiment. And that's kind of what I would like to think of these kinds of conversations as. The best kind of conversations that are collaborative and about ideas are themselves value experiments. And we're testing things out. And if we follow these norms, we're going to do it in this kind of friendly way that helps us make progress. Okay, I'm technically out of time and have to be thrown into the rain. But if you want to give me a couple more minutes, I can just quickly tell you how I think this approach solves all those problems. I have 2 minutes.
Could you tell us how this approach solves all these problems?
What a wonderful question. Perfect. So here, I think I can do this really quickly, and then we can talk more about it. I think that what you get in each one of those problems is a failure of one of these norms of conversation, right? And so now you have a kind of principled reason for thinking that cross-cultural philosophy as a great conversation is less susceptible to these problems than it otherwise would be. So think of cultural appropriation. So I suggested that that's kind of like the worst kind of plagiarism. And it's exploitive, and it's disrespectful. So now imagine how a conversation would go if every time somebody said something, you were like, you know what I was thinking, and you just repeated back to them what they were saying. That would be awful. That's not it. And what norms does it violate? Well, it violates a ton of them, right? So you're obviously not accommodating the person. You're obviously not being sympathetic. You're obviously not properly summarizing what they're saying. You're obviously not understanding them before giving advice. Right? And this is how it's going to work in, I think, all the cases, especially for, projection and chauvinism. The same sorts of things are going to come up in a conversation. If you think you're superior to somebody in a conversation, the conversation's not going to work. You're not going to be listening. It gets a little more tricky with things like incommensurability, but I think that it's helpful because incommensurability, is there really incommensurability? Like in a conversation, do you really have nothing in common with that person? Or are you just giving up too early? And so I think the idea of a conversation here doesn't solve the problem that maybe traditions are incommensurable. But it gives us reason to think that we shouldn't presuppose that they are. And that the only way we would find out is by having a conversation, by exploring them. I guess with translation and mediation, something similar. Maybe you don't know the language. Well, what if you had somebody you wanted to talk to, and you didn't know their language. Well, you have a lot of different options. One, you could learn the language. That's hard. So, I mean, it really is. It takes a lot, and we're all very old, and we're not going to do it. And we're going to learn a little. So maybe just learn a little, or learn a lot. That's one option. But another option is to get somebody to help you. Get a translator who can mediate. Find another way. And I don't think that if I'm talking with somebody through a translator, I don't understand them, right? I don't think that if I read a translation of the Iliad, I'm just not getting the Greek, you know? I mean, yeah, obviously I'm not, but I'm getting a lot, and sure, it's mediated, and I'd have to know how the translator works and stuff like that, but it's not a lost cause. And if I really want to know the person, well, this is my shot. This is the way to do it. Okay, so I think this has some promise. I have another thing to say, but I want to hear what you have to say beyond the question that I made you ask. No. So thank you for listening to all of that.